A prince swung a legendary sword and slipped on his own belly. He impaled himself through the chest in his own bedroom. This happened right in front of his own maid. The prince died before he even hit the floor. 1 second later, the sword itself woke up inside the body. Time moved forward. A skinny kid stood across from his own uncle. The uncle was a powerful 4-ring monster of a knight. The boy whispered a single line of an old poem. Suddenly, the entire training yard detonated like a bomb. The scene shifted to a royal banquet with every noble watching. A crown of pure light formed above the kid's head. A cape of light unfurled down his shoulders. Every person in the hall dropped to their knees. This included the ambassador of a bullying empire. That empire had been bullying the kingdom for 400 years. Later, a 1,000-year-old elf walked into the hall. She pulled back her hood and looked him in the eye. She calmly announced her intention to marry him. Then, the Orc King returned to human territory from the frozen north. This followed 4 centuries of total silence. The Orc King formally challenged the young man to a duel. Listeners might think this is a typical underdog prince story. However, that assumption would be incorrect. The real main character of the show was not the prince. Instead, the protagonist was the sword itself. This weapon was named Gruhan. He was an ancient sentient blade forged 400 years ago. Gruhan once drank the blood of a dragon. He served as the weapon for one of the 5 prince-electors. These legends were famous historical figures in the kingdom. For the last few centuries, Gruhan slept quietly in a royal vault. He waited for someone worthy to pick him up again. One day, an idiot finally picked him up. This was the first prince of the kingdom, named Adrian Leonberger. Adrian was a boy who only cared about eating and being arrogant. Nobles and his own father despised him. Even his own knights barely tolerated his presence. Adrian wandered into the vault and grabbed Gruhan from the display. He gave the blade a couple of swings to look impressive. Immediately, he tripped over his own belly. The point of the sword drove straight through his heart. This was the worst possible outcome for Gruhan. In his glory days, Gruhan cared about the founding king. His name was Leonberger. He was the best friend and partner to the sword. The teenager the sword just killed was a direct descendant. He was the last living piece of his friend. Gruhan had killed the last piece of his best friend. It was 400 years too late to apologize. Then, something even weirder happened. The sword slid right out of the body. The body sat up and began to breathe. Gruhan realized that he was now inside the prince. The sword had become Adrian. He was trapped in a soft and useless body. The kingdom had forgotten everything the sword once built. The maid screamed and fainted. Adrian sat on the bloody floor and stared at his hands. He looked at his enormous stomach and considered the situation. His best friend's descendant was dead because of him. He decided to make up for this tragedy. He would take over this idiot's life. He planned to turn it into something meaningful. It was a fantastic and difficult start to his new existence. The palace staff began to panic. The head maid ran in and saw the prince was alive. She burst into tears of relief. Soon, an old scholar and tutor arrived. He patted the prince on the shoulder like a proud grandfather. Then, Queen Margarita arrived. She did not care that her son was drenched in blood. She gave him a full hug and cried. Adrian learned something painful in that moment. The useless prince had a mother who genuinely loved him. Then the king walked into the room. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The king looked at the scene and folded his arms. He flatly asked why his son was still alive. Adrian tried to use amnesia as an excuse. He claimed he hit his head and remembered nothing. The king did not believe a single word. He thought his son was running a con. The king believed Adrian was pretending to avoid consequences. The verdict was instant. Adrian was confined to his rooms. He could not leave the palace grounds. He had no duties and could receive no visitors. It was essentially house arrest with better food. Adrian was fine with the confinement. He needed this time to focus on his work. The body was in terrible condition. It had to be rebuilt from the inside out. The first step was to forge a mana heart. In this world, knights received their power from mana. There were 2 ways to use it. The modern method was called mana currents. Knights wove streams of mana around their bodies. These streams were like magical circulatory rings. More rings meant a knight was stronger. Single current knights were the entry level. 2 rings were considered respectable. 3 rings made a knight elite. A 4-ring knight was a national level monster. 5 rings represented a walking legend. Beyond that level was a state called transcendence. Everyone believed transcendence was impossible in the current era. The old method was the mana heart. A knight drew mana in and condensed it. They forged it into a solid heart inside the body. This process was painful, slow, and dangerous. If someone passed out, the mana would kill them. People in this era considered the mana heart a joke. They viewed it as a low-level mercenary trick. Modern society believed the new currents were far superior. Gruhan knew a secret about the two paths. The mana heart was actually the superior path. It represented the true peak of power. The current generation simply forgot how to use it. They invented currents as a substitute. He began trying to forge a heart. The process did not go well. The body had never trained for a single day. There was no mana to draw from. Every attempt failed. The queen noticed her son was trying to accomplish something. She did not know his specific goal. However, she sent him a mana-infused medicine. She quietly left the bottle on his desk. Adrian drank the medicine and tried again. His attempts became a little better over time. Days passed as she sent refills. He continued his hard work. The body slowly began to slim down. One night, he sat cross-legged on his floor. Sweat poured down his face. Finally, he locked the power in. The mana coiled, condensed, and fused. A small and hot mana heart flickered to life. A window popped up in front of his face. This was an actual glowing status window. It floated in midair and listed his stats. Gruhan recognized this interface immediately. It was his own system from the past. He used this system for his wielders 400 years ago. It was the interface a legendary weapon showed to its owner. Now, the interface was aimed at him. Most of his old abilities were listed as locked. This included his absolute sword sense and third eye. News traveled that Adrian had shown some potential. The king did not care about this change. However, the queen convinced him to send a tutor. The tutor was Adrian's uncle, Baal Valahard. Valahard was a count and a four-ring knight. He was the commander of the Northern Legion. He was one of the 5 silver lions. People sent him when they wanted results. He would either reforge a person or break them. Valahard walked into the room and looked at Adrian with disgust. He established the rules for their arrangement. Adrian had 6 months to prove himself. He needed to earn his uncle's respect. If he failed, he would stop wasting everyone's time. Then, Valahard saw the mana heart. He nearly laughed because he was so surprised. He called it a 5th-rate mercenary trick. Valahard said his nephew picked an obsolete power path. This choice was like using a stone axe on a modern battlefield. Out of spite, he drew his own sword. He demonstrated the most basic royal swordsmanship. This training form was a drill every noble child learned. Adrian just stared at the demonstration. He recognized the beginner's exercise immediately. It was actually the legendary dragon-slaying style. Gruhan personally invented this style 400 years ago. Over time, the art had been watered down. Now, people used it as a simple warm-up drill. No one in the room understood its true power. Even the 4-ring hero was unaware of its history. Adrian did not say a word. He filed the information away for later. He politely asked his uncle to continue the lesson. News spread that the first prince had changed. His younger brother, Prince Gilliam, did not believe the rumors. Gilliam was 14 and already a 2-current knight. He had waited to eclipse his older brother. He approached Adrian in the palace garden. Gilliam issued a formal challenge for a duel. He dared Adrian to prove he was not a joke. Adrian accepted the challenge. Then, other lower nobles began to demand duels. A long line of them formed quickly. Every young swordsman in the capital wanted to fight him. Adrian grinned and told them to form a queue. The training arc began. This was not a typical fitness montage. Gruhan used his knowledge to reverse engineer the body. He knew every muscle and every failing point. He knew how a killer's body should feel. He had spent centuries observing many different killers. The fat melted away and muscle grew underneath. His stance stopped looking like an imitation. He began to move like a real knight. His sword rank increased to sword apprentice level. The day of the duels finally arrived. The first opponent was Taylor of Talheim. Taylor was a single current knight and a baron's son. He was not a bad person. However, he held a serious grudge against the prince. The previous Adrian had insulted Taylor's family. The prince never apologized for those insults. For Taylor, this fight was personal. It was not just a sport. They met in the training yard. Valahard watched the match from the side. Half of the court gathered around the railing. Everyone expected the prince to fail miserably. The audience thought the fight would end quickly. The blades met for 3 exchanges. It looked like a fair fight at first. During the 4th exchange, something inside Adrian woke up. His stance settled and his grip changed. A fragment of the old dragon-slaying essence appeared. The temperature in the yard dropped suddenly. Taylor's sword arm went numb from the pressure. Adrian began moving like something ancient and hungry. He was no longer a prince playing at night. He moved like a weapon that cut dragons. Valahard's face turned white with shock. He had read about this feeling in stories. He could tell Adrian was about to kill Taylor. The uncle drew his sword and jumped forward. He hit Adrian with the flat of his blade. Adrian woke up back in his room. Valahard stood by the bed with his arms folded. He stared at Adrian like a dangerous puzzle. He did not ask any questions out loud. However, his face showed his confusion and concern. Adrian remembered a small conversation from a few days ago. He had told his uncle, half joking, to stop him from killing opponents. Valahard had rolled his eyes at the time. Now the joke was on him, because he actually had to interfere. He realized his nephew was not joking at all. The palace hushed the entire incident up. Taylor's family received a chest of restitution shipped to them quietly. The old Adrian had wronged them once before. Therefore, the new Adrian overpaid them without a second thought. Remarkably, the Taylor boy did not hold a grudge. A couple of days later, the boy returned to the palace. He asked if he could serve as a training partner. Adrian agreed to the request. That should have been the end of the drama for the week. However, it was not. That same afternoon, a woman appeared at the palace gates in a cloak. She arrived unannounced while dragging a sword nearly as long as herself. She politely asked for an audience with the first prince. Her name was Arwen Carrion. She was an Iron Lion apprentice knight. People nicknamed her the Cliff Flower or the Thorny Rose, depending on the insult. She was there because the old Adrian had harassed her personally. She ignored the insults while climbing the Iron Lion ranks. Now she had climbed high enough to collect her debt. She looked Adrian in the eye in front of his guards. She stated she was there to duel him to the yield immediately. Our protagonist took one look at that sword, and then at her face. He grinned, and told the Iron Lion to prepare for combat. Listeners must understand this woman before the fight starts. Arwen Carrion was not a noble. She was a commoner who entered the Iron Lion Order through skill. This was the top knight order in the entire kingdom. The Iron Lions never accepted charity cases. If you cannot hold your own there, they eat you alive. Arwen held her own successfully. She obtained her single mana current at 19 years old. For a commoner, this achievement was a miracle. She earned her nicknames through sheer determination and strength. She trained on a literal cliffside for 1 year to sharpen her footwork. Once, she broke a duke's son's arm for grabbing her waist. That was her impressive resume. Years ago, the old Adrian pulled the exact same move. He was drunk at a royal reception. He saw her in her nightcoat and decided she was decoration. He put a hand where a hand should not go. She could not hit a prince at that time. He knew that and repeated the action more than once. Every noble in the capital heard about it and laughed. Arwen remembered every single insult. Then she went back to her training and kept climbing. Today, she had climbed high enough to knock on his door. They met in the palace training yard. Half the palace already stood at the railings to watch. Word traveled through the palace at the speed of gossip. Valahard stood at the edge with his arms crossed. He was curious to see how his nephew would handle a real knight. A resentful baron's son was nothing compared to her. Arwen bowed with cold correctness. Then she drew her weapon. Her sword was a hand and a half length. It was longer than most one-handed blades, but shorter than two-handers. She held the weapon like an extension of her own limb. There was no wasted motion or showing off. She simply walked into range and cut. The first exchange felt like a slap in the face. Adrian read her opening and moved to deflect the strike. However, she was no longer there. She was already inside the deflection and angling around him. He barely twisted out of the way in time. During the second exchange, the same thing happened. In the third exchange, her blade tapped his forearm hard enough to bruise. By the fourth exchange, he lost his grip for a heartbeat. He had to catch his sword mid-air. The crowd at the railing went silent. This was not the pig prince receiving a simple punishment. This was a real knight methodically dismantling a boy. Adrian thought he was catching up to the world. Valahard leaned forward and paid close attention. Adrian reset his position and took a deep breath. He ran the fight through his old sword mind. This was the part of him that watched 1,000 duels. He was not outclassed in terms of power. His mana heart was strong and his body was trained. However, he was still too slow. He had been learning swordsmanship in this body for only weeks. Arwen had been practicing since she was a child. She had 10,000 more repetitions than he did. That was the reality of the fight. He could not beat her by being technically better. Therefore, he had to be something else. He started using his weight and his reach. He utilized his absurd new stamina. He forced her into longer exchanges to exhaust her. He took hits he did not need to take to maintain rhythm. Every time she disengaged to reset, he crowded her space. Every time she tried to end the fight, he messed up her ending. The duel stopped being clean and started being ugly. Ugly was fine for Adrian. Ugly was where his body advantage lived. After 1 hour, both of them were breathing hard. After 2 hours, Arwen was visibly annoyed. After 3 hours, the sun dropped and the referees called a draw. They decided to resume the match tomorrow. Arwen had never fought anyone she could not finish in 20 minutes. She stared at Adrian like a math problem she could not solve. Then she walked off without saying a single word. On the second day, the second round began. It was the same situation but worse. Arwen had spent the night studying his movements. She adjusted her style and he adjusted back. They traded blows for 6 hours until sunset. The referees called the match undecided again. By the third day, the whole capital was watching. The Iron Lion barracks emptied out to see the duel. Nobles who usually avoided training yards miraculously found time to attend. Even the king watched from a balcony. On the third day, Adrian decided to gamble. Halfway through the exchange, he stepped back and raised his hand. He looked at Arwen and proposed a wager. If he won, she would sign on as his personal knight. Arwen thought about it for 2 seconds. If she won, he would never fight her again. He would also apologize publicly on the palace steps for every insult. Arwen nodded her agreement to the terms. This was a big mistake on her part. Now he had permission to stop being polite. He dropped his stance lower and changed his grip. That old feeling leaked back out of his soul. This time, he held the leash tight. He did not want to lose control. He just wanted to remind her who he used to be. Their swords meet with a loud clash. His dense mana heart flared with heat. Her single current curled elegantly around her blade. On paper, her power was stronger. However, in practice, his heart hit her current at a wrong angle. Something in her wrist gave way. Her sword arm sagged by a half-inch. Adrian was already moving to finish the fight. He swept her legs and caught her collar as she fell. He laid the flat of his blade across her throat. He told her to yield. The training yard held its breath. Arwen lay flat on her back with the blade at her neck. Her sword arm was shaking. She stared straight up at him for a moment. Then she did something unexpected and smiled. She was actually happy. She came there to test the prince. She wanted to see what he was made of now. The answer just landed on her throat. She sheathed her blade and knelt before him. In front of the kingdom, Arwen Carrion pledged herself. She became the personal knight to First Prince Adrian Leonberger. She had one condition for her service. She told him to treat her as a knight only. He was never to treat her as a woman. She would guard him and die for him. However, if he forgot she was a blade, she would leave. Adrian nodded and gave her his word. Valahard blinked as his whole face changed. His nephew had just won a 3-day duel against a knight. He turned a hostile witness into a weapon. The uncle did not say anything. However, he finally uncrossed his arms. The king watched from the balcony and said nothing. He turned and walked away without clapping or smiling. He was as cold as he had always been. Adrian did not mind because he now had an Iron Lion. Back at his rooms, he tried to keep his routine going. The old tutor came by for their lessons. Adrian used to bully this poor scholar. Now he sat down obediently and studied hard. He studied history, politics, and trade routes. He even practiced his etiquette. He started to enjoy the process of learning. Studying was never something he could do as a sword. He never got to sit still and just think. Then Bernardo showed up. He was Bernardo of the Eli family. He was the best friend of the old Adrian. In palace terms, he was the man who provided alcohol. Bernardo heard that the prince was now skinny and undefeated. He also heard about the Iron Lion at the prince's side. Clearly, something was very wrong. Bernardo arrived with a bright smile and an invitation. He spoke about a social club for young masters. It included heirs from all the top families. He promised great food and great company. It was a perfect place for a reforming prince to reintegrate. The Eli family used to be a great house. However, they backed the wrong political horse a century ago. They were stripped of most of their land. They eventually slid into the merchant class. Bernardo was all that remained of their legacy. His whole worth depended on his proximity to the crown. If Adrian vanished, Bernardo would become irrelevant furniture. He had a strong motivation to stay close. Adrian realized this was likely a setup. However, it was exactly what he needed. He had to know who among the nobles were enemies. He agreed to go and brought Arwen with him. Arwen wore her night coat to the club. She was like a red flag on legs. The room was exactly as advertised. Over 20 sons of counts and barons were there. They were all dressed in silks and half drunk. They welcomed the prince with loud smiles. However, they welcomed Arwen with a specific kind of quiet. Someone made the first insult within 10 minutes. An earl's son whispered that it was cute the prince brought a pet. Another asked if knights were accepted based on chest measurements. Someone else suggested she climbed the ranks through other talents. Arwen's face did not move. She was a professional. She had heard worse insults in worse rooms before. However, Adrian's face did move. He set his cup down very gently. He stood up and walked across the room. He approached the earl's son who made the pet comment. He asked the boy politely to repeat what he said. The boy grinned and repeated it louder. The prince punched him in the jaw immediately. The force lifted the boy off his feet. The room went dead quiet. Someone dropped a wine glass and it shattered. Adrian straightened up and cracked his knuckles. He asked if anyone else had comments about his night. He remained very casual and calm. Nobody said a word. However, someone did have a sword. Two of the older boys reached for their belts. This was a very bad move. Adrian attacked the first boy before the sword cleared the scabbard. He snapped the boy's wrist and took the weapon. He used the flat of the blade to knock the second boy. Arwen had already moved to the other side. In less than 1 minute, the club was a mess. Noble sons lay on the floor clutching their body parts. Adrian walked toward the door. Palace guards were already outside the room. Arwen had quietly signaled one before the fight started. He told the guards to arrest everyone in the room. The captain of the guard hesitated. These were the sons of great houses. Adrian remained very calm as he repeated the order. Adrian informs the captain that they insulted a knight. The insult occurred in the presence of a prince. They also struck weapons in front of that same prince. Adrian tells the captain that if he wants to lose his job, he should keep hesitating. The captain does not hesitate again. 14 young lords of the kingdom are walked out in irons. The parents lose their minds. Within hours, 4 different counts, 2 marquises, and a baron arrive at the palace. They pound on the doors and demand an audience. They want their sons released and the prince punished. They want blood. The king summons Adrian. This meeting is the moment every viewer has waited for. The cold father and the reforming son are alone in a room. No witnesses are present, and all the ammunition is on the table. Adrian walks in, bows correctly, and waits. The king asks flatly if his son knows how much political damage he caused. Adrian says he has some idea. The king asks if he plans to do anything about it. Adrian says no. Silence follows. Then Adrian lays out the case. His personal knight has a signed oath that is a matter of public record. 14 witnesses insulted that night in a shared room. That is not gossip. It is a documented offense against the crown. If the crown lets it slide, every knight will know the truth. They will know that any child of a duke can insult their reputation. The crown cannot accept that damage. Meanwhile, if the crown enforces the law, every knight knows the first prince stands behind them. He pauses and looks his father in the eye. He asks which of those 2 kingdoms his father would rather run. The king says nothing for a long time. His face gives away nothing. Eventually, the king says the arrests will stand. The 4 counts, 2 marquises, and 1 baron must accept the situation. Adrian bows and leaves. Outside the throne room, he ensures no one is looking. He lets himself smile. His father is cold, but he is not stupid. The king calculated that a reforming Adrian is genuinely useful. A small crack appears in the ice. Then he goes and finds Adelia. This situation is painful. Adelia is a 19-year-old palace maid. She is small, quiet, and bruised. The old Adrian used to summon her to his rooms for terrible reasons. The viewer might want to beat the old version of the prince. Now the protagonist lives in that body and can make things right. The new Adrian really looks at her. His third eye authority flickers awake. The power is still locked and weak, but a sliver comes through. He can see her statistics. He almost drops his cup. Adelia has a talent grade of S. That is not the grade of a maid. It is the grade of a national treasure. Her hidden traits include war craze and spirit of submission. Most importantly, the top of her sheet lists Byron blood. This refers to Agnes Byron, the Sword Empress. She was a founding hero whom Gruhan knew personally. She could cut a battlefield in half with a single line of poetry. During the 400-year fall, the Byron descendants became servants. They forgot their true identity. The greatest bloodline in history is now scrubbing floors. The prince will not let this continue for a single day longer. He sits her down. He asks her very gently if she has ever tried to hold a sword. She flinches because she has not. Servants are not allowed to touch weapons. He tells her that she is going to learn. He teaches her the Mana Heart Forge. He performed the same process on himself. She has no training, so this will hurt her more. He warns her about the risks. If she loses consciousness mid-forge, the mana will kill her. He says she can stop at any time with no consequences. She does not stop. She grits her teeth and burns. She has endured pain for years already. Forging a mana heart is just another kind of pain. Adrian sits beside her the whole time. He keeps his hand on her shoulder and calibrates the flow. On the third day, her heart ignites. It is small and weak, but it is real. Adelia opens her eyes. For the first time in years, her back is straight. She is not a maid anymore. She looks at Adrian as if he gave her a new life. He gives her a sword. He tells her that she is now his second personal knight. The Byron bloodline is restored. She removes her servant coat and puts on a knight coat. Now, Valahard finds out about this and loses his mind. He believes his nephew has done something incredibly stupid. He has taken a girl with S-rank talent. Such talent only appears once every 50 years on this continent. He locked her into the obsolete Monoheart path. He did not use the modern system of currents. Valahard calls it a fifth-rate mercenary trick. He is convinced Adrian ruined a future legend. Valahard corners Adrian and demands an explanation. His voice is raised and his face is red. He is more furious than ever before. Adrian listens and does not raise his voice. He does not defend himself. He looks his uncle in the eye. He says he chose the path for Adelia deliberately. He will not explain his reasons. He offers his uncle a second wager on the outcome. Valahard almost throws a chair. Adrian reminds him of the first bet. That bet lasts for 6 months. He points out that they are halfway through that time. He suggests that his uncle should wait and watch. They can settle up when the bell rings. Valahard breathes hard and then leaves. In that moment, Adrian stops being a subordinate nephew. He is dominant now. The 4-ring national hero left without landing a blow. He was not outfought, he was outframed. His nephew has become someone whose calm outweighs anger. Adelia trains like a nightmare. War craze is not just a decorative trait. It means she feels more alive during a hard fight. Adrian pairs her against palace guards and senior knights. Then she fights Valahard's own men. Within a month, she defeats single current knights. Within 2 months, she trades blows with double current knights. The Byron blood does its job. Meanwhile, Arwen watches all of this and becomes extremely competitive. Suddenly there are 2 personal knights. The second knight is a raw prodigy. Arwen the Iron Lion will not be outtrained by a former maid. Both of them arrive at the training yard before dawn. Both arrive before Adrian. Adrian wakes up to find his knights already halfway through drills. He laughs out loud because it is the best problem in the world. The 6-month clock ticks down. On the last day, Valahard shows up to collect. Uncle and nephew face each other in the yard. Everyone is there to watch. The queen and the king are on the balcony. Arwen and Adelia wait at the sidelines. Half the palace guard and the old scholar are present. Even Bernardo is watching from the back with his father. Valahard states the terms. It will be a single duel until the first yield. Valahard caps his power at 1 ring to make it fair. If Adrian forces acknowledgement, he wins the bet. Otherwise, he loses. They draw their weapons. A 4-ring hero capping himself at 1 ring is not a weakness. It is a demonstration of strength. He says he is much stronger than Adrian. He will win even with his hands tied behind his back. They meet in the middle and Valahard opens the attack. His single ring is denser than a normal knight's reserve. He is a monster wearing training weights. Adrian's mana heart burns at full brightness. Even then, the outcome is a coin flip. For 30 seconds, the situation looks bad. Valahard is faster and cleaner. Adrian loses ground with every exchange. The crowd expects him to lose. Then Adrian plants his feet. He inhales and speaks. He recites 4 lines of a poem. The chivalric poem system runs on lived achievement. A knight can only recite verses tied to their own feats. Adrian's first poem is common grade. It is tied to his duel with Arwen. He uses 4 lines of plain language. When he speaks, mana snaps into shape around him. A ghost of the stance used by Arwen forms. His footwork sharpens by an entire rank. Valahard's eyes widen. His nephew already has a personal poem. That usually takes years to achieve. They trade 5 more exchanges. Adrian is now even with his uncle. However, being even is not enough. Valahard will still win an even fight. So Adrian inhales again. He speaks words that have not been heard in 400 years. He recites the Dragon Slayer's poem. It is a myth-grade poem. It is the poem used to cut down the last dragon. Valahard's blood freezes at the sound. You cannot recite a poem you did not earn. Reciting such a poem without the proper rank is fatal. It shatters your mana heart and drowns you in memories. Adrian opens his mouth anyway. The yard goes silent. His mana heart flares with blinding white light. Then it audibly cracks. A hairline fracture appears down the middle. Blood runs from the corner of his mouth. The air folds around him. The shadow of a real dragon surges up behind him. It is a memory of the dragon Gruhan killed. Its wings spread across the whole training yard. Valahard tries to guard himself. Adrian cuts through the guard and the current. He cuts through the shoulder and the pride. He does it all in one motion. Valahard drops to the ground. Actual and total silence follows. The palace guard forgets to breathe. The queen covers her mouth with her hand. The king is standing up on the balcony. Adrian sways because his mana heart is broken. The mana in his body is running loose. He is one bad breath away from death. Adelia catches him before he hits the ground. Arwen covers them both with his sword out. Valahard lies on his back and looks at the sky. He laughs and then coughs. He says out loud that he acknowledges Adrian. The bet is won. Adrian passes out. He wakes up in his bed a day and a half later. He is not okay. His mana heart is cracked but not shattered. A shattered heart kills in seconds. A split heart leaks mana at every heartbeat. Physicians have never seen anything like it. In the modern era, no one has a mana heart. The queen has been at his bedside for a long time. She has not slept. Adrian opens his eyes and sees his mother crying. She is sobbing without regard for palace protocol. The old Adrian never made her proud. New Adrian beat a national hero and nearly died. She is not sure whether to hug or slap him. She decides to hug him. He cannot move much because his ribcage is bruised. He manages to squeeze her hand back. The ancient sword inside the prince feels something new. He feels like a son. Then his door opens and Adelia walks in. Adelia did not say a word. She knelt beside the bed. She took his other hand. She started talking very quietly to no one in particular. She was reciting a poem. The poem was not from any book Adrian knew. It was not a classical verse anyone had recorded. The poem was hers. It grew inside her over the last few months without anyone teaching her. She recited it in a small, steady voice. Her eyes stayed on his face the whole time. The verses described a servant. This was an actual servant and not a fantasy hero in disguise. The servant had no name and no future. Her life was divided into small, useful pieces for people who did not remember her afterward. Then the servant found one person who saw her as a knight. Only one person gave her that recognition. It became the pivot her whole existence turned on. The mana in the room went still. Adrian felt something enormous press against his cracked mana heart. The pressure was not hostile. It felt steadying. Adelia's newly forged heart flared beside his bed. It poured out a light that was neither white nor gold. The light resembled sunlight through green leaves. Behind her, a tree of light unfolded out of thin air. The growth was big and slow. The trunk was as thick as a pillar. Branches spread across the ceiling. Small glowing leaves appeared on the branches in absolute silence. This was Adelia's personal poem. It was technically a common grade poem. A servant's poem is the lowest possible tier. However, this poem anchored the power of a master. Whatever she could hold, her master could lean on. Her heart was added to his. Her stability supported his fracture. The leak stopped. The crack along his mana heart sealed over. The injury was not gone, but it was sealed. Adrian could finally breathe. He looked at her, and she looked back. She said out loud that her body and soul belonged to her master. The statement was not romantic or sweet. It was practical. She was confirming a contract already signed on her end. The queen stopped crying and just stared. She had lived in the palace long enough to recognize a chivalric poem. She had never seen a servant produce one. Furthermore, she had never seen a poem manifest as a whole tree. The queen quietly asked her son what he had been doing. Adrian laughed, even though it hurt to laugh. He did it anyway. One day later, Valahard came to see him. His uncle walked in alone. Valahard had a sling on his sword arm. Adrian had done actual damage in that duel. The poem cut through the current and left a wound underneath. It would heal, but he would feel it for a season. Valahard closed the door and sat beside the bed. He looked at his nephew for a long time. Then he did something Adrian had never seen him do. He bowed his head. He offered a real apology. He admitted he arrived 6 months ago with the intent to break the boy. He confessed that he was wrong. Valahard did not know what his nephew was. However, the Valahard family was on his side from this day forward. This support was public, political, and military. Valahard promised to help with the foundation of whatever house Adrian built. Adrian did not bank this favor quietly. Instead, he asked his uncle for one thing. He told Valahard to disregard everything the court had whispered about him. Adrian intended to build something new. Valahard agreed to help him. They had a deal. Adrian pocketed the favor for later use. Recovery took a couple of weeks. During those weeks, small things happened. Adalia doubled her training efforts. Arwen turned training into open competition with Adalia. Both of them became scary fast. An old scholar reviewed history books with Adrian. The queen visited every day. The king did not visit even once. One afternoon, a small box arrived from the royal armory. It contained high-quality bandages and a healing potion. Only the crown owned that grade of potion. The box was unmarked. Adrian understood the meaning. A small crack in the ice was getting a little bit wider. Once he could stand without wobbling, Adrian announced a trip. He was going to the territory of Count Ellen in the east. Ostensibly, he was visiting an ancestral estate. Officially, the trip was for convalescence and sea air. Unofficially, Adrian had a shopping list. He needed his own sword. He did not want a piece from the palace armory. He wanted a blade forged specifically for him. He reviewed texts about an old blacksmith in that territory. This smith had forged for kings. Adrian rode out with Arwen, Adelia, and a small escort. Valahard sent a squad of Northern Legion knights as protection. Valahard was taking no chances. Bernardo begged to come along too. Adrian let him join the group. He wanted to keep his friends close, and his former friends closer. They reached the coastal estate of Count Ellen. A butler named Torrance met them at the gate. A nephew named Edgar played host. The household was polite but nervous about entertaining a first prince. Adrian was easy about it. He engaged in tea, conversation, and a little inspection of the grounds. Then he asked about the blacksmith. Torrance went pale at the question. He tried to steer Adrian away. The old smith was not well. He had not taken commissions in years. Adrian insisted, so Torrance took them to a forge in the hills. The forge was a simple shack. An old man named Gerald was inside. He was hunched over a cold anvil and wrapped in a shawl. Gerald was very ill. His hands shook and his breathing was thin. Gerald looked up when the door opened. His eyes were cloudy but focused on Adrian. He looked through the prince as if looking past a curtain. Then he smiled slightly. He said he had been waiting. Adrian felt his hair stand up. Gerald walked with help to the back of the forge. He pulled oilcloth off a rack to reveal a sword. The sword was straight, plain, and elegant. The blade was a dark gray color with no ornament. Gerald held it out with 2 shaking hands. He said the name of the sword was Twilight. Gerald started forging it 40 years ago. At the time, he had a dream about the sun going down at the wrong time. He never knew who the sword was for until now. Adrian took the sword. His hand closed around the grip. He used 400 years of instinct to evaluate the balance and weight. He knew immediately that this was a great sword. It was personal, and it was his. He asked Gerald what he owed for the weapon. Gerald smiled and said his payment was finishing the work. Then he sat on a stool. He closed his eyes. He breathed out and did not breathe in again. The forge went quiet. Adrian stood there with Twilight and did not move. Adelia covered her mouth with her hand. Arwen took off her hat. Torrance the butler was weeping openly. He knew this was coming because Gerald had told him weeks ago. They buried Gerald behind the forge. Adrian handled the shovel personally. Torrance tried to protest, but Adrian kept digging. He remembered a lesson from the scholar. A knight's respect is measured in what he refuses to delegate. So he dug. At the grave, he spoke a few words of acknowledgement. He said the work was finished and would be used. Gerald's name would go with the sword forever. Later, Torrance pulled Adrian aside at the estate. He said the Count wanted to give him another gift. There was a small magic sword in the vault. The weapon was a family heirloom with one current amplification. Adrian accepted and gave it to Adelia. Adelia looked like a woman who had never owned anything. Now she held a weapon. They left the coast the next morning. Adrian had Twilight on his hip. Adelia had her heirloom blade. Arwen carried her Iron Lion sword. The mood in the caravan was ready. The next stop was Iron Lion Castle. This order was the best in the kingdom. Their headquarters was a stone fortress north of the capital. It was 6 generations old. A man named Ratmar commanded the fortress. This was where Arwen had trained. Any prince serious about power needed to make an impression here. Adrian did not write ahead for a formal reception. He rode straight to the gate with his small group. He asked for a duel. The gate captain stared at him. Word ran up the tower to Ratmar. Ratmar was a 2-current knight who was older and scarred. He had no patience for royal nonsense. He looked at Adrian, and then examined Arwen. Arwen's face told him to let the prince fight. Ratmar agreed with conditions. Adrian had to fight up the ladder. He would face every apprentice until he lost. If he cleared them, he would face a full knight. If he cleared the knight, he would face a double-current opponent. Adrian walked into the hall with Twilight. The apprentices came at him one at a time. He dropped the first apprentice in 12 seconds. The second fell in 9 seconds. The third lasted 15 seconds because he was good. Adrian then beat 6 more in under 1 minute each. The Iron Lion Hall began to applaud. People forgot their usual rules of silence. They moved him up to the full knight tier. He went through 4 of them. 2 fights were difficult. He got clipped on the shoulder. He clipped them back harder. Twilight performed exactly like a greatsword. It turned the second best move into the best option. It made the best move a killing blow. Adrian felt Gerald in the balance of the steel. Ratmar watched from the side with folded arms. They reached the double current tier. This fight was real. Dunran of the Iron Lions stepped forward. He was a veteran in his mid-30s. He had 2 rings of dense mana. Dunran saluted, and Adrian saluted back. A double current knight against a mana heart should be a slaughter. Currents naturally corrode sword energy based in the heart. This is why the heart was abandoned. Dunran expected to win quickly. Adrian took off his outer coat slowly. He proposed a wager to Ratmar. Adrian asked for public recognition if he won the duel. He wanted the Iron Lions to salute him as a knight. He did not want recognition as a prince. If he lost, he would surrender Twilight. This was his own sword, forged by a dying master. He would never get the blade back. The hall went quiet. Ratmar looked at him for 10 seconds and agreed. Dunran's face changed. He realized the prince was not just doing a demonstration. Losing meant the prince would lose his soul sword. Adrian intended to win. He had evaluated Dunran and decided he could succeed. They drew their weapons. The fight was beautiful. That was the only word for it. Dunran was a master. His 2 currents wove and folded in patterns. These patterns took him 20 years to build. He forced Adrian to defend for the first 30 seconds. Adrian defended his position. Twilight rang against the blade of Dunran like a bell. Neither man yielded. Then Adrian slipped inside a current on a footwork reed. He could not have made this move 2 months ago. He succeeded now because he had the patterns of the Iron Lion. These patterns were burned into his own poem. He tapped the heart line of Dunran. He did not strike the neck or the wrist. He hit the exact spot where mana routes cross. Twilight touched the spot very lightly. The mana heart of Adrian was smaller but denser than the current pool of Dunran. The heart punched through the crossing. The rings of Dunran scattered. They were not broken but simply scattered. Both currents came apart for about 2 seconds. In those seconds, Adrian moved inside the guard. Adrian held a blade at the throat of his opponent. He demanded a yield. Dunran yielded to him immediately. Silence filled the hall. Then Ratmar started to clap. He gave one clap and then a second. The Iron Lion Order joined him. Every knight in the hall saluted in unison. Adrian was breathing hard as he sheathed Twilight. He returned the formal salute. At that same moment, his system window blinked. His sword rank increased to Sword Specialist. A locked authority called the Third Eye unlocked at full capacity. He could now examine the statistics of anyone he looked at. The information was clean and without fragments. He glanced at Dunran. The entire profile of the man unfolded like a page turning. He saw the talent and traits and history. He saw all of it. He glanced at Ratmar. He saw a line of statistics and saved it for later. Then he looked at Arwen. He found a line at the bottom of her profile. He did not expect this information. He did not mention the discovery out loud. Then he glanced at Adelia. Her Byron blood trait had upgraded. The trait was no longer dormant. It was now awakened. Meanwhile, at the same hour, Valahard performed his own tasks. This took place on the other side of the country. He rode to the northern border. He met an old friend named Karios. Karios was the commander of the 3rd Legion at the Winter Castle. He was a 5 current knight. Karios was one of the 4 other Silver Lions of the kingdom. He and Valahard had a history of 30 years. They fought and drank together. They had disagreed politically for the last decade. Valahard sat down across from his friend. He did something the men of Karios had never seen. He asked for a favor. He told Karios about Adrian. This was not the version from Palace Gossip. He told the real story of the duel and the poem. He described the heart and the Byron girl. He mentioned the pledge to the Iron Lion. He told his friend that his opinion of his nephew had changed. He intended to back the boy publicly. Political consequences would certainly follow. Half of the great houses were aligned with the coldness of the king. Valahard wanted the Winter Castle at his back. Karios listened without interrupting. When Valahard finished his story, Karios said one thing. He had known Valahard for 30 years. He noted that Valahard had never asked for a favor. He observed that this was not a simple request. He claimed that Valahard was actually begging. Valahard did not deny the claim. He said out loud that he was indeed begging. He believed his nephew was worth the effort. He believed the kingdom was worth it. Karios poured him another drink. He agreed to provide his support. Meanwhile, Adrian and his 3 companions were riding back to the capital. Twilight was at his hip. He held the rank of Sword Specialist on his sheet. His third eye was fully active. He had 2 personal knights and a formal salute. He also carried the blessing of a dying blacksmith. He rode through a small town on the way home. An old beggar recognized him in that town. This was a small but significant moment. The beggar did not recognize the old Adrian. He recognized the new man by the way he sat on his horse. He saw the tilt of the sword called Twilight. The beggar was old and missing one eye. He was drunk in the middle of the afternoon. He looked up and mumbled. The man claimed to recognize Adrian as an old friend. Adrian reined his horse to a full stop. He turned and looked at the man. His third eye examined the beggar. The profile that unfolded was nearly blank. The system considered him a nobody with no talent or history. He was just an old man dying in a quiet town. However, Adrian saw a single name at the bottom of the sheet. It was labeled as the Origin. Adrian did not immediately recognize the name. Adrian slowly got off his horse. He walked up to the old man. He knelt in the dirt in front of him. A prince of the kingdom knelt in a public square. He asked the beggar for his former name. The beggar squinted and said his name used to be many things. He was once a soldier with a wife and a son. He had chased orcs across a dead country. He waited in a house where nobody returned. He stated that his name was Vincent. Adrian closed his eyes. Adrian realized that he knew this man. He did not know this specific body, but he knew the soul. The sword named Gruhan had seen this widower before. This happened 400 years ago in a different war. The man hated the same enemy for the same reason. The world had recycled him into this town. Adrian took a slow breath. He unlatched a pouch at his belt. He gave the old man every coin in his possession. He told the man to eat at the best table. He quietly promised that he would remember. The beggar laughed and said that nobody remembers anyone. He called it a joke. Adrian insisted that he would. He stood up and returned to his horse. He rode onward with his companions. Adelia watched the event and said nothing. Arwen filed the moment away. Bernardo did not understand any of it. They reached the capital by evening. The palace gates were open for them. Valahard waited on the front steps. His uncle was not standing quietly. He stood very publicly in full silver lion regalia. The banner of the Northern Legion was behind him. He carried a folded letter of support from Carios. 20 of his own knights stood in formation. This happened in front of the entire capital. Valahard saw Adrian ride up and offered a bow. It was a deep and formal bow. He dropped his head fully. Then he straightened up and turned to the crowd. A large crowd had gathered because word had outrun the horse. He announced the position of the House of Valahard. He declared public support for Prince Adrian. The crowd made a strange noise. It was not applause or silence, it was the sound of the ground shifting. Everyone knew the meaning of this public backing. Half the political weight of the four great houses had tipped. This happened overnight on a public street. The king watched from a tower window. The king did not react to the announcement. However, he did not stop the event from happening. Adrian dismounted and walked up the steps. He returned the bow of Valahard at the same depth. The silver lion and the prince were now publicly bound. Inside the palace, Adrian laid Twilight on a table. He stood at the window looking at the capital. The royal banquet would take place tomorrow. Every great house of the kingdom would be present. An ambassador from a foreign empire would also attend. His younger brother would be there as well. The brother was still angry about a past duel. A hooded elf envoy was also expected. Nobody in the palace had asked questions about this envoy. Adrian exhaled slowly. He was done being a weapon for others. Tomorrow he would start building his case for the crown.